As the peacock's tail acts as a cue for a healthy and reproductive bird, so the Gantt chart can be used as a cue for being organized and in control, even when you're not. My name's John Whitty, and I spend some of my time thinking about and examining what makes project managers tick. There was an article on project management in The Economist in 2005, and the byline read, "Companies are increasingly keen on projects. Why, when so many fail?" And that sums up rather nicely one of the paradoxes of project management, in that it appears to be popular and that at the same time it appears not to work. We make the assumption that modern project management has something to do with delivering projects on time and on budget. But modern project management doesn't have to be about that. Perhaps it's also a tool used for surviving in the corporate environment. I could quote you something from a textbook, but I don't think that those standard definitions are particularly defensible. I'm interested in resolving this apparent paradox of project management. Why is it popular when it appears to be broken? I conducted a piece of research that looked at the emotional affects various project management artifacts like schedules and deadlines have on long-standing project managers. And in the study, one particular artifact, the Gantt chart, stood out. And one of the participants' comments sums up nicely the behavior I observed. He said, "It's the Gantt charts that keeps my manager out of my office so I can get on with my work." And this is when I first really glimpsed that Gantt charts are used for reasons other than scheduling tasks and resources. I think we can resolve this project management paradox when we look at project management through the lens of evolution. An evolutionary or Darwinian approach to project management practices illustrates how project managers compete for the favorable attention of senior managers and stakeholders in the same way that a peacock competes against other peacocks for access to the peahen. I need to cover some basics about evolution before I answer that. I would recommend that anyone with an interest on the topic should read two books. The first is Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. The second is Richard Dawkins' The Greatest Show on Earth. Now, Darwin's book, it's a wonderful read. It's written for the layperson of his time and beautifully sets out the argument that the biological life we are immersed in today has evolved over an incredibly long time from a common ancestor, and this has happened by the process of natural selection. Darwin's book leads the reader into the concept of natural selection by first talking about selection in the domestic setting. He simply illustrates how we humans have changed the shape of animals and plants for our own purposes in a relatively short period of time. The dairy cow today looks quite different from their recent ancestors. Breeders have continually bred from those animals which produce milk, and the modern dairy cow looks like udders with legs on and a head. If you compare the modern pig to, say, pigs that were around in the 1600s, there's a huge difference, literally. Today pigs can look like walking cuts of meat. And what about the modern dog and all its varieties? Darwin then puts forward the argument that selection is taking place in the wild all the time, and that is how the animals and plants we see today have been built. The cheetah is an extremely fast land animal. It has to be because it eats animals like gazelles, and they run fast too. Of course, the situation between the cheetah and the gazelle has evolved over time, and those gazelles that could outrun the cheetah got to live long enough to reproduce, and those cheetahs that could run fast enough to catch gazelles got to eat and live long enough to reproduce. Sexual selection is a mechanism that creates features on animals too. From the male point of view, they get access to females by either fighting it out with other males in a physical way by bashing horns or biting each other, or they compete for the attention of the female by displays of plumage or singing or calling. The tail feathers of a peacock are a classic example of how the performance of one animal creates features in another. It's hard to consider a peacock's tail to be something other than an impediment, really. The tails are very large, they're heavy, difficult to carry, need loads of energy to grow, and it makes them incredibly conspicuous. Nevertheless, the peacock's tail is the way it is, and it is got that way by the preferences of peahens. The peacock's tail appears to work like a cue or a costly advertisement for its health and fitness, as only fit and healthy peacocks can afford to grow spectacular tails. Of course, the peahen doesn't consciously deliberate over her options for a mate in the same way that you or I might choose our favourite chocolates from a chocolate box, but there are some parallels. In the early stages of evolution of peacocks, all hatchlings will be slightly different to their parents. Some will be fitter and more biologically stable than others. Some fit and healthy peacocks channel energy into growing plumage and survive long enough to reproduce with the peahens who are attracted to them. And this plumage growing and being attracted to plumage trait gets passed on to offspring. The tail becomes wired in, so to speak, to both peacock and peahen. Now, it's worth mentioning that the traits from the parents get passed on because a copy of the genes from the parents gets passed on. The genes are the instruction on how to build a particular creature, plant or animal, with those particular features. And the genes, and I'm really oversimplifying what's an extremely complex process, because of the way molecules interact with one another in different ways under different circumstances, they behave like an instruction set, a computer program, if you like, that when run makes a complete body like yours and mine from a single cell. The point I want to make here is that when a feature is selected by an animal, by humans or by another animal or an aspect of the environment, it's the instructions, the genes, that get indirectly selected and passed on. I think I can finally begin to answer your question. The evolutionary approach to project management is about applying to aspects of project management the idea of selection and the passing on of instructions of how to build ideas, constructs, practices and artifacts to others. So instead of biological features or traits being copied, varied slightly, then selected, what gets copied, slightly varied and selected are social or cultural traits and practices, as well as artifacts such as tools like the Gantt chart or professional body certification such as the PMP. It might be the feature of the Gantt chart that gets selected, and who participates in the selection is a good question, but it's the instruction of how to make a Gantt chart that gets passed on. Gantt charts will vary in how they look, just like you and I look different, but there's a sequence or set of steps that must be followed in order to build what any project manager, senior manager, stakeholder would recognize to be a Gantt chart. Now, I wrote a paper called A Memetic Paradigm of Project Management, which basically introduced this selection of ideas, behaviors and artifacts to the world of project management. A meme is something cultural, not biological, that gets passed on from person to person. What's interesting about the topic of memes, memetics being the study of how memes get passed on, is that whilst we might identify a meme by the artifact, say a car, it's the instruction of how to make one that gets passed on. I've done some research with project managers on this. If you ask what are the major drivers of projects, they automatically respond by drawing the time cost quality triangle. Literally, they draw it in the air if there's no paper around. So here's an example of a project management meme. It's an instruction of how to build a response to the question, what are the major drivers of projects? The Gantt chart is a particularly interesting project management meme, remembering that the meme is not the Gantt chart itself. What we recognize to be the Gantt chart is a product of the meme. The Gantt chart meme is the instruction of how to build a Gantt chart, and it gets passed on by every course and book on project management. The meme survives, it gets passed on, because it benefits in some way the individual that hosts it. And however, the benefits of memes aren't always that obvious. In the particular case of the Gantt chart, whilst being able to draw one might help project managers schedule their projects, Gantt charts can also be used to impress or placate senior managers and stakeholders, as one of my studies has shown. As the peacock's tail acts as a cue for a healthy and reproductive bird, so the Gantt chart can be used as a cue for being organized and in control, even when you're not. So the evolutionary approach looks at how project managers have evolved, the habitat or environment that has shaped their features, which is predominantly a Western capitalist corporate environment, and what selection pressures are put on them. And by that I mean what entities such as senior managers and stakeholders might be selecting their various features. A modern project manager today is much more than just managing projects. Those who have survived in this role have done so by a variety of methods, and it is far too simplistic to say they've survived because they're good at managing projects. To survive in the role of project manager, each individual needs to be successful at being selected as the manager for the next bigger and better project. Managers have taken a scheduling tool such as the Gantt chart, and they've used it to signal to their stakeholders and senior managers that all's well, they're in control, everything has been thought of, we're prepared for the unexpected, look, we've planned for it, and your money and reputation is in safe hands. As I suspect, like the peacock and the peahen, the project manager's Gantt chart has become wired to the preferences of senior managers and project stakeholders. Evolutionary approach to project management research resolves, I think, the prevalence-efficacy paradox of modern project management. Some aspects of modern project management are about managing the project, and some aspects, such as the Gantt chart, as I've argued, are about surviving from project to project. Here's a challenge for you. Take a look at the latest Gantt chart software and ponder on the question, what are all these new features for? Have they been added because of some empirical evidence that demonstrates these features can improve the success rate of projects? Or do they reflect the preferences of senior management and project stakeholders?